Welcome to Movie Magic. I am your host, King Crusoe. You can call me KC, and today we once again have a little bit of a looser review for you guys, especially compared to the last one of these, which I suppose I'll just let you know right now was a complete review of the entire film trilogy for The Hobbit. You can click in the upper right-hand corner, I suppose, for that video in which I covered some things that I'm going to mention in this video, but it was a more or less, it was a scripted review where I covered basically my thoughts on each of the individual films of the trilogy, more or less as in-depth as I felt like I needed to get my basic point across that I don't actually think that Peter Jackson's Hobbit trilogy is that bad. But when I was going into watching the movies again, rewatching them for the first time in over a decade, ahead of rereading the book for the first time in 4.5 years, both of which I obviously have now completed, I was like, well, I think I'm going to watch one of the fan edits as well, because there's, a lot of talk, a lot of hubbub about how shorter versions of the trilogy, cutting down those like 8.5 hours of content or something like that into something that's more like 4.5 hours long, makes the movies better. And so I was like, okay, well, I found myself a copy of one of them, quite frankly, and I don't just say this for legal reasons. I say this genuinely, honestly. I don't even remember how I got a hold of the, the Maple Films. I forget if they're Maple Studios or Maple Films, but it was one of the major fan edits of the trilogy that takes down, like I said, those 8.5 hours of film into something that is, not counting the credits, just over 4 hours long. It's like 4 hours and 8 minutes or something like that. Well, I guess once you cut out the intermission there in the middle as well, you get basically a 4-hour movie out of that particular edit. And I decided that I was going to watch the 3 movies, then I was going to reread the book, and then I was going to watch a fan edit and make a couple videos about that experience. Well, I watched the 3 films. The last one episode of the series was reviewing those 3 films, and rereading the book and then watching the fan edit is basically what this video is about. I'm going to be covering that experience a little bit more fully with, the effective question of, does a fan edit fix The Hobbit? Well, I mean, if you watched my previous video, you probably know that I don't actually dislike the Hobbit movies. There's a lot about that experience that I really like. I think it gives in a lot to excess, and, it indulges itself a lot in some ways and at plenty of points where it frankly does not need to, and where it's more or less unjustified. But I found the effort and the sincerity with which those movies were made by Peter Jackson anyway, in spite of problems with studios and, requirements to make the trilogy a trilogy instead of being allowed to make it shorter. I'm not 100% sure on the details, but I believe the intent was to make it more like 2 movies instead of 3, and for those 2 movies to be a little bit shorter as well, which, might give you a proper adaptation more along the lines of some of the fan edits, for example. And so, with all of that in mind, I went into those movies just basically curious about how I would feel about them as movies, and I watched them before rereading the book, specifically so that I would have a little bit extra distance in between the book and the movies, so that I could, again, view the movies in their own right, on their own merits, on their own terms, and what I thought about them. Like I said, the last video goes into a lot more depth on this topic, but I was a big fan of those movies, actually. I think the first one is arguably my least favorite of the 3, that being, of course, An Unexpected Journey, and the reason why it's my least favorite is because even though the great parts of it, the adaptive parts of it, the whole beginning sequence, post-exposition is incredible, everything in the Shire is incredible, obviously the material involving Gollum at the end of that movie is incredible. There's a lot about An Unexpected Journey that is really, really, really good, but it also has easily my least favorite moments of the trilogy. For example, everything with Radagast within the trilogy I'm not into, because I don't like Radagast's characterization. I respect the character being included, but I just don't like the character itself as Peter Jackson made him. in the movies, and since he has a pretty big part of that movie, and because the pacing is so off with some of the extra subplots that are, being introduced, whatnot, for the purposes of the entire trilogy, but in the first movie they're distracting, so there are aspects of the first movie that just take away from the overall experience enough to be my least favorite. Comparatively, the next two movies I enjoy actually a lot. A lot of people, when they, came to see my reactions to these movies in like Discord servers that I'm part of, when I discuss the movies, posted my reviews, my ratings and whatnot, were just like, the ratings for your ratings for Desolation of Smaug and Battle of the Five Armies are absolutely baffling. And I'm like, sorry, I guess I just didn't dislike the subplots in either of these movies. And I also am very much a climax person, and I thought the Battle of the Five Armies was really epic and actually closed off all of the subplots in ways that made sense for a full trilogy, even if I think a lot of the pacing of some of it through the trilogy is messy. There's a lot to discuss with regards to the original version of those movies, but the elephant in the room, of course, is how good of an adaptation are the movies? Well, that's, sort of a loaded question, but basically the simple answer is, when it is actually adapting material from the book, straight from the page onto the screen, the Hobbit movies are really incredible. The stuff from the beginning in the Shire with, the unexpected party is all really good. The material underneath the mountains, like I said, involving Gollum, are really, really good. I think that there's the material in Mirkwood is also really great, even though the further the trilogy goes on, it starts doing slightly more weird, not weird things per se, but like the way it adapts it just ever so slightly changes things, the way that you need to make a book into a movie. So the minor changes of adaptive scenes I don't mind in the movies at all. But so like I found the tone and the way things were covered in Mirkwood really good. There's also the material like in Lake Town and in the mountain, or in the Lonely Mountain itself, that is also super solid. The actual confrontation with Smaug is quite good. There's quite a bit of material that I really like, and there's some material in there that was expanded in ways that I personally was a big fan of. I think that expanding the Battle of the Five Armies more or less into its own movie, given the requirement of needing to make this 3 movies as more or less imposed on him, I think that move was actually generally a good one, because you can have a big epic climactic sequence as long as you have enough material to actually make that make sense. And I personally felt like it made enough sense in the construction of things. I also, when reading the book many years ago, I always wanted for the material of Lake Town and the Battle of the Five Armies itself to be expanded, and those are two things within the original trilogy that are expanded quite a bit, and so I was a big fan of being able to see some of that stuff. I also said that I don't mind a lot of the subplots through most of those 3 movies, to be honest. And the thing that surprised me about those movies when rereading the book and reflecting upon the actual adaptation is that most of the subplots, yeah, I would say most of the subplots actually have some sort of base from the book. Like, they do originate in some sense from the book. They don't just seek to make the movies, a prequel of sorts to the Lord of the Rings. Watching them, I felt like that was part of what they were doing. It's just like, it makes sense for Peter Jackson to basically make these into a prequel to his films of the actual Lord of the Rings and tying those things more fully together. That makes total sense. But what I didn't realize was that even within that effort, a lot of the ideas for that stuff did come actually from the book to some extent. Even though Azog is not a character in the book, he is mentioned once, and expanding that character into a full character in the movie makes sense. It plays with the lore in a little bit of different ways, and Azog's character is dead in the book, for example, whereas he is more or less the main antagonist of the whole trilogy. And so, like, you can take that and be like, yeah, that idea came from the book. The fact that the Orcish army at the very end of the book is from Bolg, who is Azog's son. That came straight from the book, even if it was adapted a little bit to expand for the movies. Even ideas like the Gandalf subplot through books through movies 2 and 3 that had to do with, pretty explicit foreshadowing of Sauron for the Lord of the Rings. I thought that a lot of that was indulgence just to foreshadow Lord of the Rings, because why not? We need runtime. But it turns out that even that side plot is in the book, even if it's not on the page. When Gandalf leaves the company at Mirkwood in the book, it is to take care of the problem that is causing Mirkwood to be the way that it is, which is Sauron, the Necromancer, mentioned by name as the Necromancer multiple times in the book. I didn't remember that. And so, like, being able to reflect on the actual full trilogy, even after rereading the book this most recent time, I was like, there's a lot about a lot of these subplots that actually makes sense. Radagast as a character is mentioned in the book, so bringing him into the movies as a means of, being able to bring up the foreshadowing for Sauron and Mirkwood and some of these problems early on in the trilogy in An Unexpected Journey, that idea makes sense. I'm a fan of the idea, even if I don't like Radagast's character at all. So, like, I see the vision of the trilogy. My entire thesis of my review of the trilogy was, I see the vision. I get it. I understand what Peter Jackson was trying to do with, what he had and what he was more or less had to do to some extent, and how he was trying to salvage and make the best of what he could of these movies with, the requirements that he had imposed on him. I don't know if that sentence made any sense, but, like, I see what he was trying to accomplish despite what factors were more or less limiting him. And I think that overall he was pretty successful in doing so, and so I'm actually a big fan of the original trilogy. But, kind of what got me off on this entire topic in the first place was there is a degree to which the trilogy is sometimes not a fantastic adaptation of the book. Particularly with regard to some of the subplots. There are a couple of subplots that are just completely made up, for example, including Legolas into the movies was not necessarily a necessity, but from a certain point of view, I can actually see why that makes sense. But the romance subplot, which is sort of related to that, is like completely made up and, quite frankly, entirely unnecessary. I didn't dislike it personally, but I understand why there are people who just really, really hated that. In fact, the fan edit that I'll be talking about a little bit more, for example, completely cuts that out, like 100%. And I didn't even particularly notice it was missing for the most part. So, there are some indulgences, some subplots, some material that is added to the movies that isn't adaptive. And even when some of it that isn't even inspired by things from the book. Some of it is inspired from the book, but some of it isn't. And so looking at some of that material, it's like, yeah, I think that this Hobbit trilogy is really good, and when it is adapting the book, it is really good. And that's why fan edits exist. So let's talk about my experience a little bit more actually watching the Maple Studios or Maple Films fan edit of the trilogy, turning this, 8+ hour affair into a barely 4-hour film. Does it do a better job of adapting The Hobbit? Yes, actually, the short answer is, as a proper adaptation of the book, it is a much better adaptation of the book, because it does cut away all of the extraneous material, all of the subplots, all of the things that are not explicitly in the book. If you want a good film version of The Hobbit, I think that at the very least the Maple Studios or Maple Films, sorry, I don't know what they are. I think I've seen them referred to as Maple Studios, but like their website I think says Maple Films. I forget. In either case, their particular fan edit of the films makes a great adaptation. That's not to say that it's a perfect film in its own right, however, because when I was watching this version of the movies, I guess, last night, I kind of noticed a couple things. One of the things I noticed is that some of the cuts, some of the transitions between some things aren't super clean. I'm not saying this from like a technical perspective necessarily in the sense of, oh, they just did a poor job in the editing and rendering of things. No, that's not what I'm saying at all. There's only one place where that cut is awkward, and that's right where the intermission is. I don't think the intermission is in the best place personally. It's basically just exactly halfway through. And it does make sense for the intermission to be there, but I think I would have preferred for it to just be one 4-hour movie instead of having a cut in the middle for the intermission. Like I said, it makes sense, but that's like the only technical place where I think the cut just was awkward or whatever. The reason why I think some of the cutting of the movie is a little bit strange is because there are certain aspects of some of the subplots that are ingrained enough in the overall trilogy of films that removing some of that material is a little bit strange. For example, the very end of An Unexpected Journey sees Azog and his other wargs basically attacking the main party of folk before they get rescued by the Eagles. And that isn't necessarily my favorite thing after just escaping, the Goblin Cave. I don't think it particularly structurally makes sense for there to be a second like climactic event like right on top of each other like that. And in the fan edit, that scene like still exists exactly as it is basically. You can't really avoid it, I know. And it does more or less foreshadow in its own way the Battle of the Five Armies, because that is the antagonist of the Battle of the Five Armies. But when you cut out some of the other material that was cut for the film, some of it feels slightly out of place even still. Like in the original version of the movies, the prologue, so to speak, the exposition of An Unexpected Journey contains backstory to Thorin and Azog and, the dwarves in general and what's going on there, material that is flashbacked upon sometimes elsewhere in the film, so you don't actually see that footage the first time, so the callback moments elsewhere in movies feel kind of weird without that reference. Maybe that's just because I had watched the original trilogy so recently, but even so, I still feel that way. There's also the fact that being saved by the Eagles and then going from there to Beorn's house, there's actually a surprising amount of material cut out of that little sequence as well, and I wasn't a big fan of some of that material being cut. I would have liked for less of it to be cut, because you have Gandalf explaining some things to the party, but that is included as audio in the background while the Eagles are flying, and then you just cut to Beorn's house. Technically speaking, it works out for the fan edit's favor, but I just wasn't a fan of some of that material being cut, I suppose, personally. And then there's like some other aspects to the film, right? I think that even though many of the subplots being cut out make sense and you lose basically nothing by doing so, for example, Gandalf's entire side plot within the movies is cut from the fan edit entirely, and you don't really miss it. You don't need it for the story that The Hobbit is. There's a reason The Hobbit does not cover any of that within its actual storyline. And so removing that entirely from the films, yeah, fair enough, it makes sense. And I don't necessarily miss it in the context of a proper adaptation here. You could say the same thing for the Radagast stuff, for example, as well. You can look at that material and say, yeah, even though it's cool for that to foreshadow the problems with Mirkwood and whatnot, you don't particularly need it. The book doesn't have any of that stuff, and the book is really, really good without it. And so cutting that stuff, again, makes sense. There are just some certain moments where some of the side material being cut does feel like it takes away from the overall product of the movie, just because the movie, again, does flash back to certain sequences or does reference some moments, or there's some moments of dialogue or whatnot that do foreshadow or call back to other material that is now suddenly no longer there. And so there are some lines of the movie that feel awkward or strange or lack inherent meaning because the material that it's referencing just isn't there anymore, This is particularly true of like the Azog example that I was talking about, because like the Battle of the Five Armies is still a big thing, but there's some scenes and some moments with some of the orcs that like kind of don't make sense to still be in the movie the way they are, because so much of the other material involving them is gone, but you still need something to be there in order for the Battle of the Five Armies to at all make sense or feel like it was being led up to in any way, right? The fact that Azog is like the main character chasing these people around in the first movie, and then his son Bolg is the main antagonist of the second movie, basically chasing the dwarves. These two get very, very, very little screen time in the first half of the fan edit, and so when things start referencing them a little bit more in the back half, and you have like, Azog straight up calling Bolg a fool for not killing the dwarves in Mirkwood, it feels like there's a lot less meaning because a lot of that material was also kind of cut down and trimmed down a lot as well. So like some of the impact of some of it is a little bit missing for me at least. And this kind of carries through, right? The Battle of the Five Armies in general, I also felt like was not as good in the fan edit, strangely enough, because there was less stakes, because there was less building it up throughout the entire trilogy. I may think that the pacing of a lot of that material within the movies themselves, the original movies themselves, can be messy at times. An Unexpected Journey in particular is quite hampered by its structure, its pacing, and how some of the subplots genuinely super distract from things in a pacing manner. It's still true of Desolation of Smog as well, I think, but less bothersome to me, I suppose. I don't know. But the point is that all of this material being cut from the fan edit means that the Battle of the Five Armies and the climax in general just kind of had a lot less tension and a lot less stakes. Now, there is a pro and a con to this. The pro is that, like, The Hobbit itself has, a lot of a sort of a children's bedtime story type of vibe to it, both in the writing and stuff like that. And so really, maturing the tone of that and making it feel more adult, I guess, in the movies, you could argue that that isn't a very faithful thing to do tonally for the movies. And I can sympathize with that particular argument, for example. But I would also say that, like, a lot of this stuff is also precursor to The Lord of the Rings, and so aging up some of the tonal or thematic palette of the movies again just kind of makes sense for the purposes of Peter Jackson's trilogy. So I don't personally actually have an issue with that. And so the fan edit arguably actually takes away from that intent because it is a more faithful adaptation of The Hobbit, and so sort of the more adultish type of stuff. And when I say adultish, it's very loose. I'm not talking about anything not safe for work, for example. It's just, the tone of it. When things are rated PG-13 for thematic content, this is the kind of adult that I'm referring to, right? Stuff that is appropriate for teenagers, but that, like, little kids maybe a bit too much, right? And so I know I've kind of lost my train of thought here, and I apologize, but basically what I'm saying is that the slight adultification of the tone between the book and the film trilogy is something that I think makes sense and that I personally have no issue with. And so the fan edit actually taking the trilogy and making it more of an adaptation of the book ends up somehow strangely taking away from that tone, because plenty of the moments that build up a lot of that tension and kind of foreshadow a lot of things as well, a lot of that material is just removed. There is just lower stakes in the fan edit. I found myself much less engaged for the back half of the movie than I was for any of the three original movies, for example. So, like, there are pros and cons to the fan edit, I guess. What I'll try to say is, like, my thesis, I suppose, quote unquote, for this video is that rereading The Hobbit after watching the movies was great. It was a really, really, really great experience, and made me realize that the movies are actually a better adaptation than I had thought, because even the stuff that strays from the book is still inspired from the book in most cases in a way that's just like, that fair enough. That's cool. I think that seeing some of the differences there is cool, just from a personal opinion standpoint. As for the fan edit, the Maple Films / Maple Studios version of The Hobbit, I think that as an adaptation of the book, kind of what I said earlier, it is a much better adaptation of the book, more or less one-to-one. It cuts out basically all of the subplot integration, even though I have personally minor quibbles with some of the ways that certain things feel slightly more jarring in it as a result, because the side content is removed. If you want a good film adaptation of The Hobbit, this is a great way to watch it if you don't want any of the other stuff from the trilogy, or if you've seen the trilogy and you weren't hot on all of that extra stuff, you just want to see, like, again, the distilled adaptation of the book. It gets a thumbs up for me, absolutely. Definitely worth watching. My personal opinion, however, is that I am more likely to just straight up watch the trilogy again rather than the fan edit, just because I personally liked a lot of the side plots enough to want to see them and to appreciate what they're doing and to find, the crafting of foreshadowing and stuff like that with as well as it is, surprisingly, it's enough for me to enjoy personally, right? I think that the vast majority of people are going to get more enjoyment out of and respect a lot more the fan edits. I know that this is a very common opinion, just generally speaking, and I totally respect that. And I see a world where I feel the same way. I just happen to like the trilogy as is, and the trilogy as is the way it was originally made, so I'm kind of just inclined to watch those again, for example, rather than watching the fan edit. There's also the fact that watching a 3-hour movie or watching three-hour movies is, in a weird way, easier than watching a 4-hour movie somehow. I don't know if that makes any sense, but yeah, I would, if I'm gonna spend time to watch The Hobbit, I may as well just spend all day, like 9 hours watching all three of them, as opposed to 4.5 hours watching one of them, if that makes sense. So that's kind of where I fall here. Like I said, basically the final opinion is the Maple Films, the fan edit, does it fix The Hobbit? If you're looking for a straight adaptation of the book, absolutely it does. No questions asked. Whether it is a better version of the movies, also most likely true. I just found myself not quite as engrossed with the content in the fan edit as I was the first time. Like I said, a lot of the tension was lost, so I didn't the stakes weren't quite there for me. And so in some sense, I kind of enjoyed the original trilogy a little bit more, but that's just my personal opinion. I am sure many people are not going to agree with that, however. But if you did watch this movie, this video, this very rambly video, one with no notes. Normally I have notes when I record videos or a script, like I did in the last video. But this one I didn't have any notes or anything. I hope you enjoyed. If you did, feel free to do all the YouTube stuff to let me know. But otherwise, for now, I've been your host, King Crusoe. You can call me KC, and I hope to see you guys in the next couple episodes of Movie Magic in a couple weeks from now, where I'll be reviewing a couple of recent horror movie releases. So that'll be a lot of fun, hopefully.